right, should be good.
Hey, would anybody, is there setting up? Oh, are you guys ready to go?
I think so.
Okay. Who would characterize LBJ as a level 5 leader?
Only in the 7 weeks.
What time period?
If you only get to count your best time period, that's a level 5 leader. That's a really good thought, both of you. Yeah.
That's funny. This person.
All right.
So our topic was on delegation and whether or not LBJ delegated well, engaged effectively, failed to delegate, and then what was the cost and benefit of that. We also included a little bit of bonus insight that we talked about to just give a deeper understanding of LBJ. We make the argument that, and like most good leaders, you probably did both. Failed to delegate, also delegated and engaged wisely. So we define delegation, and it is entrust a task or responsibility to another person, typically one who is less senior than himself. So, in many ways, LBJ did not delegate the important stuff. So while he had speechwriters and he let them write it, he didn't delegate the final say on the content, and he made sure to include his voice, his brand, who he was, in his personal statement. Case in point, he had a speechwriter write notes for him for the call to Marie Tippett, who was the widow of the police officer that was killed along with JFK. But he made a point to go back in and add her name, the kids' names, things like that were very important and personal, and said something about LBJ and who he was. He also, maybe in a negative way of not delegating, didn't delegate any of the arm twisting that he did. So he did a lot of that himself, particularly in Congress. So to get things through that congressional logjam, which was good. With the arm twisting, he maybe could have trained some other people how to do that. Which brings to the quote about he had a talent for winning the passage of legislation. And so an important thing that he had, and shouldn't have delegated, but maybe he should have taught other people how to do that. In terms of humility, he didn't delegate or where he engaged wisely was showing who he was as a person. So when he was on the ranch and there was trash, he himself was picking that up and being involved. So he was seen as present. One of the interesting things about LBJ that we tied back to what we learned in Gateway was this concept of duality. So you see these two parts of LBJ where he engages wisely, but he fails to delegate. Or he gets involved and he treats Marie Tippett with respect, but then a lot of his staff members and his own wife, he doesn't treat with respect. And then to Patrick's point, he doesn't delegate he does delegate everything that doesn't have to do with things that were really important to him and made him feel like he was creating a legacy. So his personal brand for re-election, getting the right people in the seats. We were talking about how he brought Jack Valency on the plane and he didn't even know why he was there. And then the passage of the tax bill and civil rights, and even to education as well.
So when we looked at more deeply at delegation and engaging wisely, we thought one area where he did well was the war on poverty. So he declared that his priority. He got the research team that had worked for Kennedy, culled through the research, and then he basically said, look, this is the time frame, you've got to get it done. It's a very short window, but I'm not going to get into the weeds of designing the program. That's on you. Oh, and by the way, I've secured another $500 million for you to be able to put into the program through the budget cuts. So that was one where he called the governors together to help break through the congressional logjam. Was another one where we thought he, again, coalition building, Kerry, very effective at that, but also using those people as a force, which is the same thing he did in rallying the troops at the Capitol around civil rights, right? He went to the organized labor, he went to the churches and said, we all are going to have to come together and converge on the Capitol to make sure that we can get this thing through. And then as Sarah mentioned, but by doing so much of the detail work himself, he really missed an opportunity to teach other people on his staff his legislative and political genius. He clearly understood the process better than anybody, but he didn't teach that, what he knew necessarily to other people. Maybe because he didn't want anyone to know what he was doing, but that's a different issue. And then, what were the costs and benefits of the choices he made? So this is, I think, another side to the coin of delegation. He didn't always listen to the people around him, even when they were giving him really good advice. The biggest example of that in the book was his failure to declare himself. He waited and waited almost because of his tremendous fear of failure, to name that he was gonna actually run against Kennedy in 1960, and as a result, Kennedy ran away with it. He focused almost exclusively on domestic policy that we've talked about, and he just missed it when it came to Vietnam. He probably delegated it to the wrong people, he wasn't involved, and it literally cost him the election in 1968 and probably his health. And this was the picture that, for me, when we went to the LBJ library, stood out the most, of this almost a broken person. And I think my father served 2 tours in Vietnam. He went over to the war right after he graduated from West Point and lived with PTSD his entire life. And I think the weight of what happened to the soldiers that were sent over there weighed heavily on LBJ for the rest of his life. So this is a perfect example of how these choices can literally destroy a man. And I love this quote, "I can't win and I can't get out."
So we kind of went through a lot of different examples of delegation and whether or not LBJ did great here or kind of maybe not so great here. We, at the very beginning, kind of talked about how we were going to add a little bonus at the end, and we found it very interesting that these were LBJ's secrets to success. And this is what he believed that made up a successful leader. And so we kind of found that interesting, but we couldn't really call out any of that being delegation as one of those key critical components. But kind of tying back to like our core competencies, number 5, the political savviness, we did feel like that was one of his strong suits. Not only understanding the political landscape, but he was able to create successful relationships, strategies and outcomes, and he was really able to find those political alliances and kind of pull on the different strings where he knew he needed to pull in order to get things done. And so you could either call that engagement or you can call that delegation, but he had that political savviness that we thought made him successful, at least during that duration that we are highlighting. So, questions?
Was that an actual quote of his? No, right?
Yeah.
The suck one?
Yeah.
He said that?
Okay, the quote at the bottom.
Yes, he did.
Really?
Yeah. He said, this was his top 10 list of what he thought made an excellent leader, but he said, in truth, I pretty much suck at all of these. And then what he said after that, but I'm working on it every day, which I thought was a nice testament, again, to the duality that Sarah highlighted, that, he was a complicated person, and he was both things, humble and also egotistical at times.
And I think some of us pointed out in some of our posting too, whether it was like humility, but then it almost kind of borderline on some insecurity and whether he questioned his own capabilities. So there was a lot of that.
I wonder if in a lot of ways he just kind of suffered from like a multiple personality disorder in terms of he would channel a certain personality in order to get something certain done, and then on another scale there was a whole other personality to deal with a whole other thing. And ultimately, all of those things swirling in your head. It drives you mad.
I think it's an excellent point, and it was something that we actually talked about in our team discussion. But it's almost the ability to be the person you need to be in order to deal either with an individual or to deal with a situation is actually a really great leadership skill. Having multiple personality disorder, probably not so much.
What you said, Craig, on someone's comment to one of the posts was, can you be a great leader and be morally questionable along the lines? And I think that speaks a lot to what you're saying of like, there's a line between going in and reading the room and understanding someone and saying, okay, you need me to come in and communicate, like Carrie was talking about the colors of communication, like I know how you need to be communicated with, and being completely disingenuous to manipulate someone by becoming someone you're not. And I think that is kind of the Johnson treatment where the line gets really blurred here, and so I've been thinking about that question a lot, especially when you think about duality of, was he a great leader, was he morally, questionable, where do we fall on this? And it's like, I think keep coming back to the time point that keeps coming. For the time, yeah, there's still some issues there, which then made me think about,
We talked a lot about that duality, and like it was almost like a chameleon, and even some of Carl's other books, like The Path to Power, he's almost kind of painted him as manipulative. And so you're right.
So that's a question I've had, and it's something I think we've talked about back and forth, is because for me, I know he did great things, but I don't know if he did them for the right reasons, and I don't know if he did them the right ways. Do you think that his true personal agenda and everything was just win?
I mean, so, I think it's a great question. I feel like where I landed at the end of this discussion was to say, I think that he was a really great politician. And politicians have to understand the political process. And it's unsavory at times. And like a lot of us don't have a strong appetite for it. But for him, it was what made him successful. I think he was at his heart a liberal. I think he believed in civil rights. And maybe he kept that hidden in the South in order to get elected. And does that make him a terrible person? Probably not, because, you know, people switch parties and do crazy things to try to get elected if that's what you really want. We didn't read the beginning of the book, but in the beginning of the book it talks about how ever since he was in high school, he wanted to be president. He used to tell his classmates, I'm going to be president of the United States. Like, and everybody mocked him, and this was like the thing he wanted. So it's like he wanted it so desperately, and yet he was so afraid of failing at it. And also, you know, he was willing to do whatever it took.
Carrie, I think you're right. I think he drove no matter what to win, no matter what the cost was, how it adjusted, who he had adjusted. But I think at the end of the day, towards the end of his term and the weight of Vietnam and everything that had gone wrong, I think that kind of came to bear on him. I think he
But
no
also-
longer cared about winning, it hurt him.
I think he did care, like, about winning, but he cared about people. That was genuine. He taught school in Cotulla, Texas. He
Yeah,
knew
that's what I was-
what it was like to be poor, and he did care about poor people. And yes, he used his power in strange ways, but he also did it for good.
Yeah.
You know, and you could pass a lot of stuff that isn't so great for people.
I think he just struggled with the fact that he threw like childlike temper tantrums prior to getting into that office, and then how much his demeanor changed. So which was the real demeanor?
I think it's probably both. I don't think it's black or white. Drive for winning, punctuated by humanity. And I
Yeah.
think there's a level of, he's both. Because at the beginning, I think he was really genuine with Kennedy's people of like, I need you. I cannot do this without you. And sure, there's an agenda, but humility can be genuine and strategic. And then I think the fact that Vietnam was his cross to bear forever is that. And I think there's punctuations of humanity in between. But I think like all politicians, he's probably driven to win. But I don't think anyone is ever so black or white that they're fully genuine and fully disingenuine. And so I think that's the confusing part of LBJ.
Well, I wonder, first of all, where you draw the line of manipulation or just accomplishing what you're set out to accomplish, right? And we've read like with Professor Jarvis Luntz.
Yes.
And it seems icky and like you're manipulating people, but what is your ultimate goal? If you know that people's desire, which he did, he knew that America wanted civil rights passed, and it was Congress that was blocking it from passing. So if not for Vietnam, would we be calling it manipulation, you know?
I mean, you know, in some sense, to your point about the Luntz work and all of it, it is slightly manipulative, you know, but also, you know, selling a car and all the other examples that are mentioned in the reading for Jarvis's class, right? There are all these tactics that people use to try to
And so we're trying to learn it, right? I mean, because ultimately we all have agendas that hopefully are for good, to learn how to advocate for that. So I feel like if we judge it as manipulation, then we're turning ourselves off to the possibility of what we can learn from it.
I couldn't agree with you more, and I think the question is, do you use your powers for good or do you use them for evil?
Because that's, I think, the line between like persuasion and manipulation. So most communication is persuasive in some sense, but, and I think maybe we could call LBJ intensely persuasive. And uses his, his physical presence to be intensely persuasive, and maybe it crosses occasionally into manipulation. But I think it really comes down to intention in a lot of ways, and we're never gonna really know what LBJ's intentions were.
All right, Patrick, did you have a?
My comment was, I think a lot of it goes back to, I think, you go back to the last slide is practice liking people. I think another one on there that he doesn't always want to admit, but people liking him, I think it just is also just as important to him.
I think so too.
Yeah.
So I have a question for you guys. The question that you were actually asked to answer included a preface that was, what are the things that one decides to take on for himself or herself, in this case Lyndon Johnson. So what did he feel that he needed to take on, and was he right? I don't disagree with anything you said. I'm layering that on top of what you said. And so what does that teach us about him and about us? What did he do that he took on himself?
Well, I mean, immediately he took on that he was gonna pass Kennedy's agenda. It had been stuck, he tried to get Kennedy not to send the civil rights bill.
He adopted a strategy.
Yeah.
What tasks did he take on for himself?
Within the strategy or
What tasks are outlined in the book that he took on for himself to move his strategy forward?
His
I mean, I think
relationship
what we're
building.
trying to allude to here is all of the arm twisting that he did. The calls, the deals to try to get what he wanted done. And
So
I mean, to me, that was what he spent the majority of his time, on the phone.
So was that the right call? Was that the right decision for him to take that on versus delegating that?
Yeah, it was personal.
I mean, I don't think, for two reasons. Number one, because of the state of the country at the time, and because even, people who knew Kennedy in Washington were still reeling from it. I don't know who else would have been around to take it on, but secondly, there was no one who knew. I mean, he was the master of the Senate. No one knew how to get that stuff unstuck better than LBJ. So I mean, in that sense, I believe, right or wrong, that as flawed as he was as a human being, there's probably no one that could have actually gotten that through so quickly in the days after Kennedy's death.
I would agree with that last comment, by the way, for what it's worth. So you're not alone. Maybe it's just two of us.
Well, that's not, I live by myself.
it was the
No, I
task,
agree with
right?
I agree.
I agree
That-
as
that-
well.
that-
No, I
he
think
feel anyone else could take that on to him, because he already had that relationship with him. He knew how to placate some of his interests and say, help me, educate me, walk me through this. He knew what he knew was important to him. He knew the strategy to get things through. He didn't think anyone else could have that and make sure that interaction in small sequential, either small phone conversations, quick little lunches and stuff like that. He didn't really want to have that relationship ended or fixed by anyone else. That's one he would not delegate.
And can I just say?
It's too,
Yes.
I think you're all right. I would also add that time and the clock was his enemy, and he
Yeah.
knew that. And he knew that only he could jump on the phone and move things in a way that needed to move because time was of essence. Because
So-
1964 was coming up, he knew he was gonna have to keep the presidency and the party intact and everything else, so time was his enemy, he knew it.
So there's an election, there's a legislative calendar.
Correct. The
Yeah,
legislative calendar in
You
particular
have
is what he had
activists
in mind.
waiting to hear what he has to say.
A
Dr. King?
country that was in a state of turmoil, that was not going to be getting better until this fundamental rights issue was addressed.
And he delegated the congressional affairs stuff to Kennedy's people and said, get to the Hill, go meet with these people, I'll get on the phone.
Right, and
So he
before-
deployed an army.
But when he,
Before he did that,
I'm
sorry,
sorry,
no, before he did that, what I think is important that in terms of tasks he took on himself was this strategy of unity we need and the value of unity, and then he went to Kennedy's people himself and was like, please stay, I need you more than Kennedy needed you, which I think was a really important task long before he could ever delegate. And I don't think he would have been able to delegate tasks like you're saying to Kennedy's people had he delegated getting them to stay to anybody
Well,
else.
then we get it done under JFK, so, I mean, how's he gonna delegate some of that stuff?
very good point. Yeah, why would you not want the master of the Senate to lead your legislative initiative? Right? I mean,
Yeah.
that's the bottom line.
But there's limits there too, with the discharge petition, he sat down with King and said, here are the names of a bunch of Republicans that presumably I know I can't move. You go work on them, this thing's gotta be a route, I'll do what I can elsewhere.
Yeah.
I don't know what the result of King talking to those Republicans was.
Well, I mean, they got the bill passed, you know, and it was, but knowing what you have to do and what other people can help you with is something that each and every one of us faces. And so, you know, you think about, I want to delegate. Yes, you got to delegate a lot, but there are things that you shouldn't delegate. Relationships that are fundamental is one of them. You can't let somebody hijack your most fundamental relationships. You can associate and lend them in a sense, right? But carefully. And he could never, nobody could ever have the kind of relationships with members of the Senate that he had. It would take years.
When he, because I think there were two things that Caro described, right? He described him as the best one-on-one salesperson that ever lived, and talked about his ability to understand what motivated someone and to lock into that. And so I think it was Bird who said once he knew how to get you, he never let it go. Like once he knew what would get a man to do what he wanted him to do, and so only he could have, you know, held Bird and Russell in check throughout the whole thing.
Well, and you know, and in a sense, I mean, why was Russell still his friend at the end of this process, right? You gotta ask yourself. Yet Russell was somebody who, in spite of his, in my view, horrible position on civil rights, was somebody who had, in other areas, great respect.
Yeah.
He was a guy who was the go-to guy on armed service issues in the Senate. You know, it's like, we've seen kind of this discussion come up in recent days in you know, who do you work with and how do you work with them? And to what extent do you work with them? It's an interesting question.
That insight to me is very powerful, because I feel like maybe what we've lost in today's world is the ability to sit across a dinner table from someone who believes something very different than what you believe, and to actually still build a relationship with that person. You know, that on the areas that you do have common ground. You know, and we don't do, but LBJ did that.
Well, and you don't have to make them your child's godfather.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.